I'm recording in the cloud, Courtney. Okay, that should start. Let's see. Okay, we're ready.
Ready, set?
Yes.
Okay. Hello, my name is Louise Endres Moore. Thank you for your interest in my book, Alfred, The Quiet History of a World War II Infantryman. For 17 years, and yes, you heard that right, 17 years, I read and researched, I spoke with World War II veterans, and I tried to find my dad's Army buddies while I wrote his book, which is more about reality than heroism. I simply called it Alfred. My dad was raised in Martinsville, and he was fluent in the German language before he went to school, which is probably why he couldn't say THs. So he said dis and dat, and thinking about thunder and other words like that. And I used those patterns of speech when I quoted him in my book, and some people have said that they can hear his voice. Shortly after Pearl Harbor, when my dad was almost 24 years old, a government official went to my grandfather's farm and asked him which of his two unmarried sons would he choose to go to war and which would he choose to keep at home to help him on the farm. And my grandfather said he could not make such a decision. So my father volunteered to go so his brother Edward, who was younger by less than 2 years, would be able to stay home. Within months, Dad left for training, and then about 1.5 years later, he came home on furlough and my parents got married, and then they both went together to California where Dad finished training. By the time Dad left for Europe, they were expecting their first child, who was Eileen, and who he would eventually meet when she was 13 months old. I actually never set out to write a book, but my father's experiences were so unexpected and complicated. I knew if I didn't write them down, the history would be lost. And basically what happened is that he was in his 80s, like 83, 84, before we even began to understand what he had done in World War II. We had never known that he was a heavy weapons machine gunner on the front lines, most of the time with Patton. We had only known he was a barber, a chauffeur, and a translator because that's all he had told us. The title of the book is written in his own signature from military papers. And this is obviously a photo of him, but to me, it is the shadow of his face that looks exactly like him later in life. And during his life, he spoke very softly. So that's why I included The Quiet History as a subtitle. In general, he spoke very softly, but as of war, he spoke barely at all. So I needed the perfect circumstances, a perfect set of circumstances to learn his story. First, my mother died. Then within 6 months, my dad broke his leg and he never learned to walk again. So he had to leave his farm and he moved to Good Samaritan Center nursing home in Lodi. That's when I told my siblings, I'll do Saturdays. So I ended up alone with my dad for several hours on most of those Saturdays for 5.5 years. Because he spoke so little of the war, I had to ask a lot of other veterans to fill in the gaps. For almost a decade, I could talk to Robert Phillips in Georgia. He gave me this little necklace, which is the symbol for the 35th Division. He was the closest to anyone I found to a gunner in the 1st Battalion of the 320th Regiment of the 35th Division. For even more than a decade, I could talk to Don May whenever I wanted. So I researched, and then just before Dad passed away, he said something that triggered my most difficult research, and that was his involvement on the Normandy beach landings. All the experts told me that his words were not possible, but with the discharge papers of his friend Albert Simon, I proved instead that his story was very likely. In talking to my dad, I had to be gentle with my questions. So one week I was reading and it said that a particular soldier could never eat fruit cocktail again after the war. On the following Saturday, I said to Dad, I asked him, how do you feel about fruit cocktail? And he said, it's okay. And that was the end of our conversation for the week. But I really doubt he ever had fruit cocktail because he was eating K rations. And that's what this looks like. They're basically this size. There's no fruit cocktail in K rations. That's more of a rear echelon thing or headquarters or something. And they maybe had too much of it, but the frontliners weren't getting fruit and vegetables. But it was just the beginning of me learning about the infantry. I have a map that shows the general tour of duty for the 35th Division. So primarily they were in France, Belgium, and Germany. And I'll show you the map. Okay, so it's just a little chunk of Europe. Here's London and England, France, Switzerland, Germany. Here's Belgium. They went through quite a bit of Belgium. They just touched into Holland, and this is tiny Luxembourg. As far as the 35th Division, they landed on Omaha Beach in July of 1944. That's a month after D-Day. Dad's landing is more complicated because I eventually figured out that he had been a replacement on D-Day. He told exactly one grandson. And actually, I didn't find out this comment until after the book was published. But he told one grandson that there were body pieces and parts all over the beaches when he landed. That entire story of how I figured out he was a replacement, it needs more time and explanation from the book. But, okay, so they are now here. And just beyond the beaches, there's an area of hedgerows. Hedgerows separated fields, either for ownership or for animals. And it's a mound of dirt that is 4 to 10 feet high. And it has trees and bushes on top of all of that. And the Germans had spent years building and living in hideouts. In fact, they would steal mattresses sometimes from French houses. And they kind of had little living quarters built into the hedgerows. And they were just waiting for the Americans to attack. Some say it's similar to the caves of the island of Iwo Jima. Anyway, the United States had hoped to take Saint-Lô or Saint-Lô. You can see they're relatively close. They had hoped to take Saint-Lô within 9 days. But even after 37 days, we still did not have control of that city. It was a major communication center for the Germans in general with Saint-Lô, and then there was roads leading off in all directions. So if you had control of that city, you had control of the roads to transport supplies and everything. In the end, Saint-Lô was almost entirely destroyed, and a soldier of Dad's 320th wrote about, and this is the quote, the horrible stench of hogs, cows, and dogs and men lying dead together. But one thing he didn't mention is there were also French civilians buried in the rubble. So they also were there, lying dead together. Right after Saint-Lô, right after Saint-Lô in this area, the Allies carried out the largest carpet bombing in the history of the world. 2,500 planes dropped bomb after bomb after bomb every couple seconds for an hour and a half. Some of our own soldiers were accidentally killed by our own bombing during that raid. Sometimes I'm amazed how long it took me to write this book, and amazed is kind of a gentle word, but I needed 13 of those years before I found Bob Esser. And he's important to me for the understanding of, for my understanding of Mortain, and also to maybe personalize it for me. Eventually, I realized Dad never said anything to me about Mortain other than the word. That's all he said, the name of the city. So what happened here is that Bob Esser's battalion from a different division had control of the top of the hill outside the city. Therefore, Americans had the best view of the entire area, which is desirable. The Germans were trying to push Bob Esser's battalion off that hill. And for 6 days, Mr. Esser survived on 1 K ration, those little box that I showed you, and a rabbit. And then Dad's battalion was ordered to rescue them at the top by breaking through the enemy. Almost half of the Americans at the top had been killed. And after the war, members of the German staff said that the war was lost at Mortain. It was kind of their last chance to push us back into the water, into the sea. So they claimed that when they lost Mortain, they lost the war. Okay, so after Mortain, the 35th could move more quickly across France. So that occurred more quickly. And in September, they were asked to clear the Gramercy Forest of the enemy. This is when Dad learned about the birth of his firstborn child, about 2 weeks after Eileen had been born. And on that day, his battalion had been surrounded on 3 sides by attacking Germans. And there was even a fear that the entire division might collapse. I'm quite certain he never expected to see his daughter. I asked him once, what did you do when you heard that Eileen was born? And he answered too quickly, I don't know. And I think whatever happened was something that wouldn't make sense to a newborn, in that situation for a typical newborn or a new father. Okay, so that's where they were in September. In October, for one day, they got an 8-hour pass and they could go over here to Nancy. And they could take their first shower after more than 3 months. And then the troops returned to the Gramercy Forest. Okay, here's Nancy. And they returned to the Gramercy Forest, where some of them had to sit in their foxholes for 23 hours a day during excessive rain. It just rained and rained and rained for weeks. And I think about that that's a worse form of quarantine, I think, than what we've had. But anyway, then they went back, so they went back to the Gramercy Forest, and then they went up, crossed the Bleeze River, and went into Germany. But suddenly there was a surprise attack to the north, which became the Battle of the Bulge at Bastogne. So the Germans broke through up here, and they had to quickly move. They didn't go to Bastogne directly, they went to Metz. And the reason they went to Metz is they had to pick up replacements for all the casualties that they had lost, all the men that they had lost in their previous campaign. Also because they had had 162 consecutive days of combat, Patton personally gave them an extra day in Metz so they could have Christmas dinner. But what really happened is that the dinner made a lot of them sick. Dad mentioned it. He had been on K rations for so long that eating normal food was a little bit of a problem. Then, here's Metz. Then about 4 o'clock in the morning, they were rushed up to some tiny villages south of Bastogne, and then eventually into Bastogne. They would sleep outside in temperatures of 10 to 20 degrees below zero. They were not in foxholes because it was too frozen. And they couldn't light fires for warmth because then the enemy could see them. Dad remembered, he told my brother Bob, he remembered fighting 4 or 5 days without sleep and without eating anything. And in the way that he spoke, he said, except those hard candy bars that made me thirsty, because you couldn't say the THs. The candy bars are D rations. They're high in calories to sustain the soldiers, but it's not what you want to eat for too long. After the Battle of the Bulge, so we're up here at Bastogne. After the Battle of the Bulge, they went down to the Vosges Mountains because they were expecting another German breakthrough, but it never happened. They were there for just like 5 days or so, and then they were moved 300 miles north, where they crossed rivers, captured German cities, liberated the city of Venlo, Holland, and then they proceeded to the Elbe River, where they met the Russians at the end of the war. And it's written small here, but they were involved in 10 river crossings, 1,600 combat miles, 5 campaigns, and 10 months of combat. So each one of those, the campaigns, there's 5 campaigns, there's a chapter written on each one of those. That would explain them much more. So. I believe, okay, so this, I believe this, the cover of the book was taken, the photo on the cover of the book was taken in the Vosges Mountains of France. And I'm surprised how calm and relaxed Dad looks after Bastogne, because when I asked him what was the worst part of the war for him, he said it was Bastogne. But when this picture was taken, the battle was over, and the Vosges Mountains were a vast improvement over the Battle of the Bulge. For almost a week, and this doesn't sound particularly awesome, but they were very delighted with this setup. For almost a week, they slept on the frozen ground of German-built foxholes. And the good thing about that is, okay, they were still sleeping on frozen ground, but they were in the ground rather than at the Battle of the Bulge, they were above it. And the Germans built better foxholes. They were big enough, they had more time to do it. So it was big enough that two men could lie down at the same time. And they had logs as roofs to keep like the 8 to 10 inches of snow out. There was artillery flying overhead, but no one was trying to kill them 24 hours a day. So they were very content. One person wrote that they were hoping that they could spend the rest of the war there. Another thing about this, for why Dad may look content, is that he was more involved now, I think, in translating German than being a gunner. And that's a safer gig. He also, and you can't see this, but he's, if you have a book or get a book or whatever, have one at home, he's wearing his wedding ring, which I doubt would have been common on the front lines. And I wonder now if possibly he believes he might make it home alive to see his wife and to meet his daughter, Eileen. So during all of my time of research, Dad's jacket was hanging in the closet at the farm. And you might think, well, why didn't you take the jacket and figure everything out? But that would not have been possible. However, after I figured everything out, looked at the jacket, it confirmed what I had figured out over time. My problem was, when I first started, this is all I had to go on. Okay, it's a very small book. I thought this would be an easy process to figure out what Dad had done. It's a small book. But I also assumed that he had served his entire duty with the 320th Regiment, and he hadn't done that. So this book also kind of threw me off. But I thought he trained with them, went to Europe with them, served with them, came home with them. But that's not the case. That's not what happened. So after I published the book, I looked more closely at the jacket hanging at the farm. And like I said, the medals confirmed everything. Okay, so here's the jacket. Doesn't look particularly impressive, but there are some things on here that sometimes those big ribbons and medals, like I'll just show for this one. This is just a simple little bar here, but if you ask for their medals, they give you like a big medal and a fat ribbon that goes with it, but actually they mean the same thing. Okay, so on this jacket, these two lapel pins mean that he served with the 174th Regiment of the 44th Division. I shouldn't say served, he trained. That's the group he trained with, which I didn't understand at the beginning of my research. So that's who he trained with. On the right shoulder is the symbol for the 35th Division, who he served with. That was familiar. That's what I thought the whole war was. And then on the left shoulder, it's the patch from the 63rd Division. So the reason these two are different is because during the war, there was you would get points. And you would get points by how many months you had served in the military, how many months you had served abroad on foreign soil, whether you had a daughter. Eileen was worth like maybe even 12 points, I don't know, something like that. But you would get points. So when you had 85 points, you were supposed to be able to go home. Well, he had 95 and he was still over there. So they switched him to another group, the 63rd, because they thought he would get home faster. That's why he was transferred. And the truth is, he said he was getting letters from his friends who were already home while he was still in Europe. but I think possibly the extra time wasn't such a bad thing because maybe he could deprogram a little bit. And he was never bitter about it. But they tried to get him home and it didn't work. Okay, now in addition to that, this collar device just designates United States Army enlisted branch of service. And on the other side, the crossed rifles are for infantry. This small blue rectangular ribbon bar doesn't look all that impressive, but it's a presidential unit citation. It's awarded to Dad's 1st Battalion for the Battle of Mortain. It was the only citation awarded to any battalion of the 320th for the entire 10 months. And I explained already Bob Esser, that's for the situation where he was trapped at the top and Dad's battalion was ordered to rescue him. They both received presidential unit citations. This patch is called a ruptured duck, which at first I remember Don May saying ruptured duck and it sounded so ridiculous. I don't even think I asked him what it meant. I figured it out later when I had the jacket. It's actually an eagle, but the soldiers joked that it looked like a duck bursting through a button, so they called it a ruptured duck. It indicated an honorable discharge, and it allowed soldiers to wear their uniforms for 30 days if they had no other clothing at home. And that sounds strange to us now, but they were in the Army, you know, like he was in for 3.5 years, something like that. And clothing and fabric were rationed. And I'm sure if you left clothing home, you had siblings that probably wore it or it was passed around a little bit more. And if you came home, you probably didn't have much money. There weren't Walmarts or anything. So you were just kind of, you needed clothing. So normally after you're discharged, you don't wear it's wrong to wear your uniform, but they were allowed 30 days if they had nothing else. It also might have gotten them free or discounted tickets for bus and trains in order to get home. This is an expert rifle badge, and Dad had to hit a minimum of 36 out of 40 targets in order to get that. And he said that officers sometimes took his scores for their promotions and probably pay raises. So they got money and Dad got the medal. This is a Army Good Conduct ribbon, and it's for honorable and faithful service in active duty. The biggest thing about that, though, is it has to be free of disciplinary action. So Dad never did anything wrong. Don May teased him and said, "Oh, Alfred, you were a good Boy Scout." So to him, didn't mean too much. Okay, this is a European victory ribbon, and it has 5 tiny stars on it, which probably is difficult. You probably couldn't see that. But anyway, each star stands for a campaign. And Dad, and a campaign is about 1 to 4 months, something like that. And it accomplishes a mission. For example, reaching the Rhine River would be a campaign. Most infantrymen did not make it through 5 campaigns in World War II because they were frequently either killed, wounded, captured, or missing in action. I noticed that when I look at articles in the paper, and many times they have 3, but 5 is quite a few to make it through. As a gunner, Dad was embedded with the riflemen or immediately behind them and kind of protecting them, guarding them. The casualty rate for the machine gunners, for Dad as a machine gunner, would be a little lower than for the riflemen. But the riflemen in the 35th Division had a casualty rate of almost 400%, which means that each rifleman was replaced an average of 4 times during the 10 months, again, because they were either killed, wounded, captured, or missing in action. When I first heard about this combat infantry badge, the word badge sounded like Boy Scouts to me. But actually, this is the most revered recognition. It's worn above everything else. So even if you have somebody who served of their lives in the military, they have all kinds of these kinds of bars going on down here. This is still at the top. It means the soldier was involved in active ground combat with the enemy, and even Eisenhower did not have one. So even though this doesn't look particularly impressive, There are certain honors here, like this is important, 5 stars is important, this is important, that's important. And it verifies everything that I learned. Because so many of my father's war memories were painful, I wanted to find something pleasant about the war. So from the signatures on the back pages of the 320th, okay, there's little, can't see them real well, but there's little signatures. There's actually 10 of them. There's 10 signatures of friends, and then there's one where it's Johnny Majerzik's dad. And Dad included it here because he was from Grand March, Wisconsin, and I suppose that Dad thought maybe someday he would see him. Dad never saw any of these people again after the war. However, he didn't see them, but I did find Benjamin Lane down here from Houstontown, Pennsylvania, Benj S. Lane. And I wrote to him. He was easy to find because he was from Houstontown, Pennsylvania, and he remained there. And I looked today, and Houstontown has a population of 1,400. That always helps. I sent him a letter. He called me, and he said of my father, I loved him like a brother. So we planned for these 2 soldiers to reunite at a military reunion in St. Louis, Missouri. And we were planning to drive Dad, 2 of us were going to drive Dad 400 miles with his wheelchair, walker, nebulizer, while independent Ben was going to ride a bus by himself 700 miles. And I was always skeptical of that could even happen. And as it got closer, I hadn't heard much from him. So I secretly called his daughter, and she said he'd been recently hospitalized and he was now on oxygen at night. So I knew that wasn't going to happen. So 4 days before the reunion, I canceled. And because Dad said if Ben couldn't go, he didn't want to go either. So these 2 soldiers, Ben and Dad, the ones that found each other, or, connected after the war, at least on 1 phone call. They had been together in Metz, France for Christmas Eve, 1944. And the 35th Division was able to bathe again at a bathhouse there after over 2 months without a shower. The manager of the bathhouse admitted that he had no gifts to give to his children for Christmas. So Ben and Dad took their fruit and chocolate from the Army over to the manager's house, where he met him at the door. He had tears in his eyes. Dad was always really humble, and he never wanted to get credit for anything he didn't deserve. So he told me, he said of Ben, well, it was more his idea than mine. He didn't want to take credit or get credit for anything he didn't deserve. I suspect he wanted his chocolate. But anyway, the manager respectfully and hopefully said that he would see the soldiers when they came back from battle. And fortunately, both of them came back from the Battle of the Bulge, and the manager gave them gifts. And Dad's gift was this ring, and it says in French, more than yesterday, less than tomorrow. It's kind of worn off after too many daughters have worn it. So because of that history, 58 years later, in order to create a good memory for my dad about the war, I decided to try to find that manager of the bathhouse because, that wouldn't maybe have worked so well, but I knew Dad had told me that the manager had come to the United States to swim. And I thought in 1944, really, how many international swimmers could there be? So I went online and I stumbled upon the Swimming Hall of Fame in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And they said, we can't help you with that, but we'll forward your letter to the French Swimming Hall of Fame. And the very next day, the French said, we will try to help you. And then this was one of the easiest things I did, actually. Then 8 days later, the French again emailed me and it said, Madame, I think we found, and had in quotes, our man. So, that went extremely fast, something that couldn't be done without the internet. So I wrote a letter and had it translated to French, and then I received a letter and had it translated to English. And one of the kids said they remembered the gift, and he said, I truly thank your dad and Ben for their kindness. Because it was Christmas time, we sent baskets of fruit and chocolate to both of the veterans. And I think that was probably the most effective thing I ever did for Dad. And actually it was relatively easy, but I kept trying to find more. So one thing I had read about is that a combat infantry badge could be converted to a Bronze Star. Usually, or many times, Bronze Stars are given for a particular action, but what they were trying to recognize is that if you had a combat infantry badge, you deserve a Bronze Star. So I sent in some papers or whatever, and he was awarded a Bronze Star. But when he received it, he didn't touch it or look at it. And he said, I don't know why you should get medals for killing. So that didn't work. But then he also knew that Americans didn't understand war, whereas the French did. It had been on their land. They lost their farms. They lost their animals. Civilians died, all of that. And the Europeans understood it. They had seen it. So when a French Legion of Honor was available, or made available. And what I mean by that is you had to nominate, they only gave 100 a year, starting 60 years after the war. There were only 100, and he was one of the first years. But I nominated 3 people, and one was rejected. I don't exactly understand why. But anyway, Robert Phillips, my buddy from Georgia, I nominated him, and I nominated Dad, and they both were awarded French Legion of Honors. Anyway, the French Legion of Honor is to acknowledge services rendered to France by persons of great merit. General Eisenhower got one, and people like Steven Spielberg, and there's many people have gotten one, but it's significant. And Dad had been involved in 3 of the campaigns to liberate France, and then he had the Presidential Unit Citation for Mortain. So he was awarded the French Legion of Honor, and by the French consulate, in front of 100 people and 2 TV cameras. And it wasn't on the day, it was when I watched the video that I noticed how emotionless he was. And we didn't understand really why that had happened, but I had stood in front of the whole group and I summarized his tour of duty. And on that day, so here it's a special day, but on that day he realizes we don't know about the Normandy beach landings. So that was a problem for him. In fact, I mean, it's like I said, it's in the book. And I said something like, so you were involved in D-Day +1. And he said, Day said I wasn't. And he was complaining about the French. He couldn't be mad at me, so he just blamed the French for what I did. But anyway, they didn't have any more records than what I could give them or what they could pull up. I showed him a picture of a Higgins boat that was used on Omaha Beach on the landings where the front of the boat comes down. And he wept. And that was about 3.5 months before he passed away. And after that flashback, I never asked another question about the war because I never expected that to happen. So even though this book is about my dad, it honors every soldier who's ever served on the front lines. And even though it's about World War II, Vietnam veterans have told me that they identify with his feelings about war. Over time, I came to understand the phrase, the struggle to survive survival. Okay, the struggle to survive survival. My brother spoke to a Vietnam veteran at a little bar in Dane, and the bartender was not interested. Bob was suggesting a book about Vietnam, and the bartender said, I'm not interested in anything about Vietnam, not a book, not anything. He went and he served another patron, went back to my brother and said, sometimes I think those that died over there, they were the lucky ones. About a year into my research, I told somebody about my dad's feelings about war, and this woman had a very blunt and simplistic theory about it all, and she said, some can take it and some can't. After such a conversation, I realized why Dad would not speak of his experiences if you were going to get hit with something like that. Experiences can be very different from one veteran to another. In World War II, only 10% served on the front lines, whereas 90% were support, who probably never saw the front lines or never understood them. I heard other callous comments, and one of them occurred at the nursing home. And I'll read to you just the little section about that from in the book. It was in the dining room on a Saturday. And just for the sake of conversation, I simply said, Dad got a letter from the French government thanking him for what he did in World War II. A table mate joked to Dad, I suppose you walk behind the tanks. Dad said matter-of-factly, no one did that. Everybody was shooting at the tanks. Behind the trees? The table mate asked with a smile. I knew the answer for that one. No, if artillery hits a tree, it sends pieces of wood and shrapnel into everything below. The man continued, I always wanted to be in the war, a Fraulein on each arm. I watched Dad's face for his reaction, but even with my lifelong knowledge of the man, I detected nothing. The conversation changed, and eventually everybody left the table except Dad and me. I commented, he does not seem to understand what you went through. Dad looked out the big window with a slight nod of his head toward the driveway. What good does it do to have two guys out there shooting at each other? We left the dining room and I slowly pushed Dad in his wheelchair down the hallway. Just as I turned to enter his room, he said something. I stopped, leaned around the back of his wheelchair and asked him to repeat his words. Maybe it's good I touched a war. At least I know what it is. Within the last months of Dad's life, I was leaving after my usual Saturday visit, and just as I was passing through the doorway to go out into the hall, Dad said, good luck, instead of my goodbye. And he usually would say goodbye instead of his usual goodbye. He never expected me to write a book with his name on it, I'm sure. And he knew he hadn't given me much when I asked questions. He knew he hadn't been a lot of help, but he wished for me whatever it was that I wanted. And recently I thought about what it would have been like had Dad been alive when the book was published. And I'm absolutely certain that his family would have hung a sign on his door at the nursing home that said, Alfred does not want to talk about the book. Thank you. And so now I conclude my talk by thanking you. If you have any questions or interested in more information, there's a website called alfredthebook.com. And if you know of somebody else that might be interested, the website is a good place to start just to learn little bits. Maybe a gift for Father's Day. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you. It was wonderful. I do have a question. One question that came in said, I am wondering if there was one aha moment that made you realize your dad really had much, much more to talk about, or was it a more cumulative sort of thing?
Do you know what? I think I could just see his pain. I don't think there was an aha. You knew that it was buried there because you could see the pain, I think. And also, when I was spending a time alone, we didn't talk about just that. Initially, when he was in the nursing home, we'd go out and visit people or whatever. But I would kind of try to have like one thing to maybe ask about or to think about or to see. But no, there wasn't an aha moment. We always knew. I feel I was born knowing he did not like war. I think I knew that as a little kid. Nothing was said, but you just knew it. So I just think I knew it was there and that it deserved, that I should try to figure it out. Mm-hmm. And little bits were coming out, like right when Mom died, like right then, I think one of my listeners here, Ann Mopat, said that that frequently happens where when a significant support person passes away, sometimes they open up a little bit. So I think a year before my mom died, he told a family friend something, and then within months of Mom dying, my sister Dell had gotten one of these blue books, and she made copies of that for everyone. And I think he was looking at that book, like within a couple months and then he broke his hip, and then he ended up in nursing home. So.
Okay. And one other question, I think you already explained it. Someone said you should share the story about your gold ring and its connection to the story. Is that the ring with the bathhouse?
Okay, I'm sorry, say that again. I didn't hear it.
Okay, you should share the story about your gold ring and its connection. That's the gold ring, you talked about that.
Yes. This, okay, so what happened is, yeah, he gave the fruit and chocolate. When they came back from the Battle of the Bulge, then the manager of the bathhouse gave this ring. And Ben got a different item.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
And then another question, who was one of your favorite veterans you got to know through your research? Did you grow close to any of them or their families?
Mostly probably just to them. And Don May was special. Okay, this is just kind of a cute story. I don't think he would mind if I said this, but he was pretty close to blind, so he was limited in what he could do. So he would talk to me for long periods of time. And one day I called him and he said, "Oh, this is awesome timing. I just used the restroom and I'm good now for 3 hours." So he could talk for long periods of time. And Robert Phillips was special. I went to a reunion and he said when he got there, he realized he didn't even know what I looked like. But anyway, so I attended 2 reunions when he was there. And he was the closest to my dad's position. And in fact, he didn't think he knew my dad. And then about, I think 3 years, I'm not sure of the timing, after my dad passed away, he was looking in a scrapbook and he had a picture in a scrapbook of my dad with Louis Gogol. So he just figured my dad had to be in the 2nd platoon and he was in the 1st.
That picture is in the book.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, another question. Are you still researching or going to write another one? I really liked how you wrote this book.
Oh, man. Oh, how old would I be? Of course, I think maybe there's a couple things, though. I probably would be faster writing the book, but, I found a lot of people, and it's harder to find people now because they kind of block their phone numbers. ATT directory, anywho, used to give out all the addresses, all the phone numbers. People were more likely to have landlines, so more people were listed online. So there's certain parts of it that were easier, let's say in 2005, than what it is now. In 2005, you could find people a little bit more easily. No, because cell phones aren't listed usually on that, so it's landlines. But no, am I going to write another one? Oh, man, not that I know of. I didn't expect to do this one.
You never know. You never know.
I never know. Oh, man.
Well, Louise, you just scraped the surface of this book. Hopefully, it gave people a tease of what is inside the pages. Going across Europe in the winter, and how in the conditions of these soldiers during the winter months and what they endured and still had to fight is astonishing to me.
They were not really equipped very well. They were not equipped for the Battle of the Bulge because the slogan had been, "Win the war in 44." So they were hoping to win before the winter season. So they were sending supplies rather than clothing.
Yeah.
So those they did not have. And also, the Battle of the Bulge was the coldest winter in, whatever, how many years.
Yeah.
And in the Gramercy Forest, where it was raining, that was more rain than in 100 years or whatever. So there were 2 things that they went through that way. And
I remember, learning about the Normandy landing. And I'm thinking, okay, they made it to land, so now they just have to push across without really realizing about the hedgerows and then and just the bunkers and how long it took them to get through that.
To move. Actually, the first part to get to Mortain was really extensive and intense.
Yeah, and I think in the book you said that, was it Patton or somebody said if we hadn't won Mortain.
Right, I think it was the German staff felt that, I see, Patton maybe said that from the other aspect.
Yeah.
What I'm remembering right now is the German staff saying we lost it at Mortain.
Yes.
That's where it was the last chance to push us back into the sea. The other thing is, my dad's tour was pretty bad. really. And so was Albert Simon, but that's all in the book. But anyway, Dad was never trained for an assault landing.
Yeah.
And he landed on June 2nd in Wales. And that's why they said it was not possible for him to be on the beaches, because they said there's not enough time. They wanted to get those men on the beaches, and they ran by train with lights on, threw them on boats. I think they were strong farm boys.
Yes, they were strong.
Spoke German, strong farm boys. And
right. I'm going to unmute, just see if anybody else has a question before I go into, we got one, before we go into, I'm going to show the website in a minute too.
Okay.
So let me unmute all.
So
Okay.
I'm looking at
I've
it.
unmuted. Hello?
Oh,
Maybe Sandy, do you have a question? I've unmuted everyone. I think maybe if people are talking and then they're showing up on the screen. Okay, I'm just going to go, I think I'm going to leave people muted because I think people are, go ahead and talk, Louise, so we can.
I have something to say.
Oh, okay, good.
Louise is mute.
Pardon?
I'm the granddaughter of Susan Endres Kelcher, which is Alfred's oldest sister. And my mom is on the line, Louise, and she's listening while I Zoom from California. And you've done a fantastic job. And just interesting that I did a master's interview with my grandmother about her wedding day. And so I have an oral interview with her talking about her wedding day and also her family. And in the meantime, my mother sent me over a photo, and I don't know if people can put me on speaker view, but this, take yourself off mute, Louise. This is the Endres, Alfred's in the back middle. Is that right, Louise? There you are.
No, okay, just a second. No,
Okay, do I need to turn?
just one second. I think that's Adolf. He's next to, okay, Sister Luana.
Yep. Can you guys see?
Edward, Edward, Adolf, Alfred? Eileen or somebody, can you confirm?
yes.
I know.
Yeah.
That's what okay, it goes Sister Luana, okay, so you can identify her. And then it's Edward, the one that stayed on the farm and was a little less than 2 years younger than Dad. And then Adolf was married at the time, so he wasn't as much of the government was asking for which unmarried son. So Adolf was married, and then the next one is my dad. And then Catherine.
And then my grandmother is seated over there on the